As Taylor of Bolton. My Lord, I think I anticipate a rush to the exit. So just give us a minute and then we'll start. Okay.
My Lords, I'm very pleased to have this debate today, and I do thank those who have put their names down to speak. It's really interesting to see the level of expertise that there is in this House on this subject, and I think it proves the value of this House in terms of contributing to wider debates. One of the reasons that I wanted to discuss this issue was the pressure on maternity services that I've been hearing about in my local area. In Kirklees, we have no NHS birthing facilities whatsoever, and this is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. The unit at Huddersfield Royal Infirmary was suspended over 12 months ago. The Bronte Birth Centre in my former constituency of Dewsbury, and I remember the opening was a fanfare and something to be celebrated, that has been closed since August 2022. And the basic reason for these closures has been the crisis in staffing and the level of staffing shortages. Now, the local trust is trying to reopen the Bronte Centre, working with a neighbourhood trust, but the problems of staffing are having a real input and will be a deciding factor. My Lords, no one can doubt the critical importance of maternity services. Those of us who have given birth will recall many details, good and less good, of that experience. And the actual experience of maternity care can affect the future of both mother and baby. A difficult birth experience can affect bonding and early relationships, a point that's been emphasised to us by the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And everybody who is involved in maternity services will know the very significant responsibility that they have. Thankfully, most pregnancies end in the birth of a healthy baby, though that in itself does not mean that the mother's experience has been optimal. On the other hand, some expectant mothers have their own views of what their experience should be, and sometimes those views are not realistic and can create extra pressure on midwives and others. I know locally that the Trust has reported that more high-risk women are wanting births in settings that are designed for low-risk women, creating extra pressure and highlighting the complex problems that many midwives have to face. My Lords, I want to start with the recent important reports on the state of our maternity services overall. The report from the Care Quality Commission is absolutely critical here, I think, but we've all received, I believe, many briefings from mothers and babies, from the Maternity and Midwives Forum, the Nuffield Trust, Mumsnet, SANS, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and of course, the Royal College of Midwives. And these reports all consistently report a very alarming situation. The Care Quality Commission tells us that prior to COVID, the maternity services were under pressure and that has worsened. So COVID did not help. But, my lords, we cannot continue to use COVID as an excuse for all the failings in all our services across the boards. The pressures on maternity services have been building for more than a decade. The Care Quality Commission tells us that almost half of all the maternity services inspected in 2023 have been rated as either in need of improvement or inadequate, nearly half. An increase on last year, things moving in the wrong directions. There are many factors that have been highlighted by the CQC. Staffing shortages, and especially retention issues, which I'll come back to in a minute, I think are at the top of the list. But they've also reported systematic racism, leadership issues, and workplace and environment issues. All of these are significant and each needs attention. But we should not lose sight of the overall situation and the fact that nearly half of these units are causing concern. And in those circumstances, I think we do need to stop and think about what needs doing and what needs doing urgently. And I say to the Minister, and I know that there's been considerable ministerial churn, and I know that current occupants may try to distance themselves from previous decisions. But new ministers must say there should be greater emphasis on women's health, etc. But this is the same party that has been in government for 13 years, and decisions during those 13 years have made the situation worse. So I do think ministers and that government are culpable. My lords, to my mind, the most significant problem is clearly the shortfall in staffing, and in particular the imbalance in the workforce because of retention problems, the fact that so many senior midwives and indeed gynecologists and obstetricians are actually leaving their professions. There are concerns about the number of students going into midwifery and their experience, but the problems of retention make the situation critical. Earlier this month, the BBC reported on midwives being concerned that staff shortages were actually causing safety issues. One midwife reported that she kept patients safe, but only by the skin of her teeth. Another said she had quit because she could not face the possibility of the consequences of poor care. And I know of one experienced midwife who left her chosen profession after being in sole charge of 6 women in labour and being afraid for her own mental health because of all the pressures that responsibility was bringing. The Royal College of Midwives says that staffing is the most important issue, and we hear that some trusts have 1 in 5 jobs unfilled. In Kirklees, the figure is 18%. But it's not just a matter of getting more students into midwifery. Retention is a very serious problem. Burnout is a very real issue. And if we can't retain experienced midwives, then we cannot give student midwives the support and the mentoring that they need during placements. Now, there have been some suggestions that existing midwives feel threatened by some of the training changes that were introduced a few years ago, and there's always a question about the balance between theory and practice. And certainly the profile of students in midwifery and nursing generally has changed. I know from my time as chair of the University of Bradford, which has a fantastic department in this respect, and maybe the Minister would like to visit, I know from my time there that the profile of students into nursing has changed significantly, and especially when the bursaries were cut by this government. The intake of mature students declined sharply and immediately, and it has not fully recovered. And it's been pointed out to me that having mature students amongst the student group actually helps everyone to develop and understand what all the pressures can be. And of course, many students are feeling the cost of living crisis and wanting to work to survive financially, which obviously is not easy if you're on a midwifery course. And I do worry about the figures for those dropping out of their courses in the early years. One factor that does particularly worry me is that I'm told that there is less continuity of supervision of students on the ward during placement. It was the case that each student had one named mentor, but I'm told that that is no longer the case, and that students are therefore reporting that they no longer feel part of a team, part of belonging, and that was also affecting the dropout rate. Overall, this is a worrying picture, and unless the government addresses the retention issue, I don't think we're going to make the substantial improvements that we need. My Lords, I must also talk about maternal mortality. The latest report shows that maternal mortality has risen to the highest in 20 years. And one key finding is that the maternal death rate for black women is 3 times higher than that for white women. And for women from Asian ethnic backgrounds, it's 2 times higher. And unsurprisingly, women living in the most deprived areas have a maternal mortality rate twice as high as the least deprived. And this is not a new revelation. Other reports have talked about this for a very long time, and there is no excuse for a lack of action here. And I note that the Select Committee in the Commons pointed out that at the time they were writing their report, the Maternity Disparities Task Force hadn't actually met for 9 months. That cannot be acceptable and shows a rather worrying level of complacency. My Lords, I've outlined a very depressing situation, and urgent action is needed. I know that midwives and others do deserve credit and recognition for the work that they do. And indeed, I know my noble friend Baroness Thornton will be telling us about the remarkable achievements in her area of dealing with the consequences of female genital mutilation. And I know from my colleague in the other house, Jess Phillips, that midwives are always also often very critical in helping women escape from abuse. But overall, we have a crisis. And for such a significant service as maternity in 2024, this is unacceptable. And it's up to the government to provide a proper lead to solve this. And I emphasise again that the number one priority must be the retention of experienced nurses and midwives, and we need a raft of measures to reduce the pressure on midwives and allow midwives to feel that they can do the job that they're trained to do and want to do to the level that they themselves want to achieve. If this is not tackled urgently, the actual retention issue, then there will be no space at all to deal with all the other issues, such as updating training. And this is all against a general backdrop of very serious health inequalities which exist in this country anyway. My Lords, we are now in 2024, and it is just wrong that maternity services are causing such concern. Every woman deserves the best while pregnant and during childbirth, and every midwife deserves the right conditions in which to work. The Minister said at question time, in answer to a question earlier, that he believed in evidence and common sense. I would urge him to attach that common sense to some of these problems that we're facing in this year.
My Lords, the question is motion be agreed to? My Lords, it gives me great pleasure to follow the Noble Baroness, Lady Belton, for a very, very interesting and incisive career. And I see congratulations are being told her right now, and she deserves them. So thank you very much for this. One of the things that struck me as the Noble Baroness was speaking was the concentration that is so important on relationships. And it's all the relationships that are involved. The parents, the rest of the family, grandparents perhaps, but of course, most important is the relationship of the staff with the women and their babies. And we do know that there is huge pressure on midwives at the moment, and the Noble Baroness actually raised that issue, and we know that it is considerable. My Lords, Baroness Taylor has raised this debate, and I think it's a very important one, and I'm extremely pleased that she has taken the opportunity to do that, because although as she and many other members in the House of Lords feel very strongly about maternity services, the beginning of new life, the way that the women and indeed the babies are looked after and so on, is absolutely critical to the well-being of this country. And I think it's a very interesting debate to have raised, and I thank her very warmly for that. We know that maternal and mortality rates are at their highest for the last 20 years, since the last 20 years. And that is actually quite shocking. And that is something that really must be addressed. And I hope through this debate we will raise the issues that are important. I would like to say something about when I chaired the National Maternity Review. I was asked then by the Chief Executive, the Chief Executive of England, who was then Lord Stevens. And I was given the task of completing the review in 9 months, which seemed a very appropriate time. And we published our report in 2016, and we called it Better Births. It set out 5 years to plan, to work towards improving maternity services in England. I have to say I was very fortunate to have a really wonderful expert group of people on the review team, and that was hugely helpful. But the important thing we did was to go out and listen to the women of England, to their partners and their families, and to the staff who provided maternity services. We listened and we learned from them. Not just women who were already mothers, but women hoping to become mums in the near future. We heard uplifting, inspiring stories of good maternity care and good outcomes. But we also heard some truly sad stories where care had not been good or outcomes had been devastatingly bad. But what we heard guided us, and the 5-year plan we set out was based on what women told us as what they particularly wanted. At the core were 2 things. 2 things that we believed would raise the quality of care and improve safety and lead to better births. The first was that women wanted, and they felt they needed, the same midwife or a small team of midwives throughout the maternity journey. They wanted a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. They wanted a midwife or midwives who knew them, understood them, and respected their birth plans and the choices that they were making. We call that continuity of carer. Baroness Taylor has raised this afternoon the issue of continuity, and we do know that continuity leads to safer care and better outcomes for both the mum and the baby. Yes, continuity may be challenging in the face of workforce pressures, but we do need to be much clearer that continuity is the model of care we want to see. And I think that's what the Noble Baroness was stressing, and I support that. Second, women and their partners want to feel and to know that their continuity of care is shared around them and by them. We call that personalised care. It is centred on the woman and her baby, based around their needs and their decisions, and where they have genuine choice. Informed choice, but with unbiased information. Too often care is done to women and babies, rather than chosen and shaped with and by them. Again, I know that when staff are under huge pressure, taking the time to understand a woman's choices and build care around her may be really very difficult. But this is what we should be striving for all women. My Lords, continuity and personalised care were at the heart of the 5-year strategy. They stand at the heart of turning the phrase better births into reality. And today's reality falls short on both continuity and personalised care. Our country is still one of the safest in which to give birth, and I do want to stress that. But we have met some, and we've met some of those actually wonderful staff that run our maternity services. But the evidence tells us that we are not achieving the progress that we could and should. The most recent Embrace report on maternity mortality tells us that 293 women died in pregnancy or within 42 days of the end of pregnancy in the 3 years between 2020 and 2022. And that is significant. That is a significant increase over the previous years, and it excludes COVID-related deaths. My Lords, the CQC maternity services for 2022 tells us that 10% of maternity services are inadequate and 39% require improvement. And I was delighted that Baroness Taylor did mention the work of the CQC. I think it is so important. But when you consider 10% of maternity services are inadequate and 39% require improvement, that accounts for nearly half of all services. The CQC says that safety and leadership are particular areas of concern, and they need to be addressed. And we are all sadly familiar with the services of local failings in maternity care and in the inquiries that are followed. Thinking of Morecambe Bay, Shrewsbury and Telford, East Kent and Nottingham are just examples. Parents who've been involved in these inquiries are now calling for a full national inquiry. My Lords, I think they are right. My Better Births report was published in 2016 and had a 5-year plan. Those years have now passed, and I believe we need a fresh, strategic national inquiry and a new, coherent, practical plan for the whole maternity system. We need to tackle the issues of poor quality and poor outcomes. We need to listen to women and their families and the staff who are there to care for them. And we need to be guided by what the evidence tells us and will lead us to better births, to make them safer, better, and a good experience as far as is possible. Finally, my lords, I'd like to repeat something from the letter that I wrote to the women of England at the start of the Better Births report in 2016. The birth of a child should be a wonderful, life-changing time for mother and her whole family. It's a time of new beginnings, of fresh hopes and new dreams, of change and opportunity. It's a time when the experiences we have can shape our lives and those of our babies and families forever. These moments are so precious and so important. It is the privilege of the NHS and healthcare professionals to care for women, babies, and their families at these most formative times. So, my lords, I hope those words might play a part in setting the tone and the direction for what I believe is now needed: a fresh plan for maternity care.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Baroness Taylor for introducing this timely debate, and it's an honour to follow the noble lady Baroness Cumberledge with her long and distinguished engagement with many, many health issues. My Lords, I want to highlight some numbers. The Royal College of Midwives estimates that there is a current shortage of midwives across England, equivalent to 2,500 full-time staff. While the NHS workforce in England rose by 14.1% between December 2019 and March 2023, that's almost 160,000 full-time equivalent members of staff, the number of midwives over that same period rose by 1.1%, or just 247 additional midwives. The impact of this shortfall, to quote the RCM, is stark and sobering. Such shortages, staff shortages, mean women and their babies aren't receiving the high-quality care midwives want to deliver. But it's not just that staffing levels simply haven't kept pace with demand. At the same time, a rise in more complex pregnancies, whether due to increasing maternal age, increasing obesity in pregnancy, or pre-existing medical conditions, all of which may place women at high risk of complications, has resulted in pregnant women often requiring more care and more time with midwives so that these issues can be picked up. The last few years have also seen a significant year-on-year drop in students studying nursing, with an inevitable impact on the numbers who go on to midwifery. This is critical because while steps are now being taken to increase the number of student midwives, the potential positive impact of this is undermined, as my noble friend has said, by too many experienced midwives leaving. Why? Because they're burnt out, insufficiently valued or rewarded, and because they cannot deliver the quality of care they want. In addition, senior midwives are needed to provide oversight and leadership, but this essential career route means losing experienced midwives and it's having an impact on the ability to train student midwives on their NHS placements. Staffing ratios need to reflect the combination of experience and skills needed to deliver care successfully. Within the workforce planning now underway, what review of national staffing ratios is taking place, and I ask the Minister, to ensure we have sufficient staffing and funding for the population that NHS England serves? My Lords, the stark and sobering truth is that in recent years our maternity services have got worse, not better. The Care Quality Commission's latest maternity survey shows the decline in positive maternity experiences. Confidence and trust in staff delivering care, whether antenatal, in hospital and postnatal, has fallen over the last 5 years. Staff availability and communications and interactions with staff require improvement. My noble friend highlighted the BBC report from November last year, which analysed CQC data, and found that 67% of England's maternity units, more than two-thirds, have been rated by the CQC as inadequate or requiring improvement, up from 55% in the previous year. The CQC describes the overall picture as one of a service and staff under huge pressure. That's a thunderclap of a warning from the regulator. More recently, we have data showing that the maternal mortality rate in the UK has risen to levels not seen for a decade, and shocking inequalities are contained within these figures. An investigation led by Oxford Population Health found that maternal death rate was 3 times higher for black women than for white, and 2 times higher for women from Asian ethnic backgrounds. Women living in the most deprived areas had a maternal mortality rate more than twice as high as those living in the least deprived areas. Alongside the disturbing national data, we've seen catastrophic failings by specific NHS maternity units across England. The independent review of maternity services at Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust is ongoing, while the investigations into maternity care at Morecambe Bay NHS Foundation Trust, the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust, and the East Kent Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust all produce recommendations for action, all prompting new oversight groups, strategies and targets. So we now have a national maternity safety ambition to halve the 2010 rates of stillbirths, neonatal and maternal deaths by 2025, which I understand we are not on target to achieve. Could the Minister confirm that? We have a women's health strategy and the NHS long-term plan, and we do finally have a 3-year delivery plan for maternity and neonatal services published in March last year. It sets out how the NHS will make maternity and neonatal care safer, more personalised and more equitable for women, babies and families. This is a great ambition, an essential ambition, but where are the building blocks that are needed to achieve it and to overcome the stark data I quoted earlier? It seems to me we have some way to go for this ambition to become the reality. Midwives who shared their experience ahead of this debate tell me they've lost patience with reports and reviews. They say it really is about numbers. More midwives in the wards means better care for mothers and babies, fewer mistakes, a more positive and supportive culture for midwives to work in, and more reasons to stay in the profession. Invest in more staff as quickly as possible is the message I received. And as we've seen from some of the terrible failings in recent years, ensuring a culture that fosters openness and learning really matters. I was dismayed to find that a number of midwives were not prepared to talk to me because of the negative repercussions for colleagues who had previously spoken out. Donna Ockenden's review into the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital's NHS Trust maternity services, published in March 2022, puts it succinctly. Only with a robustly funded, well-staffed and trained workforce will we be able to ensure delivery of a safe and compassionate maternity care locally and across England. I therefore ask the Minister whether he can give us any new update on progress on the actions and recommendations contained in the NHS England 3-year delivery plan for maternity and neonatal services. How are they ensuring that recommendations for action and for will be widely implemented across all maternity services across England? We need to know that we're moving forward. We must do better, and we must do it quickly.
Yeah.
My Lords, I thank the noble Baroness Taylor of Bolton in initiating the debate today on maternity services in England. Or should I say, has already been mentioned, the woeful state of maternity services in England, as evidenced by a series of recent reports of failings of maternity services. Whilst we're debating maternity services, what we're really talking about is the state of care the nation is willing to provide for the mothers of the nation and their babies, the future citizens of the nation who will shape our nation. And at the outset, I'm well aware that a good quality maternity services depends on the care and expertise that the key profession, midwives, provide. The rest of us, obstetricians like me included, are there to support them. So all the comments that are made about shortages of midwives and the quality of midwives, I fully subscribe to. But before I go any further, I need to declare my interest. I am a lifelong obstetrician. I spent 37 years of my working life being one, and every minute of it was a joy and a pleasure. I could go back to it tomorrow if they let me, but they won't.
I'm not sure about that.
I'm a fellow of several Royal Colleges, but that's totally irrelevant. I'm pleased to take this opportunity to put it on record, my eternal gratitude to all those thousands of mothers who afforded me the privilege to be a part of their lives at a time that was most important time of their lives, during their pregnancy and the birth of their babies. I learned that pregnancy and childbirth gives a whole new meaning to the word beautiful. I had a special interest in looking after mothers who either had pre-existing conditions that could affect their pregnancy and the unborn baby, or developed pregnancy complications that may threaten their pregnancy and the lives of their babies. I was privileged to be able to do so. But understandably, these mothers were anxious and hope all will go well. I remember on one occasion having delivered a healthy baby of a first-time mother who had diabetes and had quite a challenging time, to say the least, during her pregnancy. And noticing the pleasure in her face, which I've seen 1,000 times, and it's quite remarkable when the mother sees her baby for the first time. I asked her how she felt. After thinking for a minute, she said, "I know the days will be shorter and the nights will be longer. Clothes will be shabbier, but the future will be happier. I will forget the past. The baby will make love stronger. I was a woman yesterday. I'm a mother today." I will never forget that. To witness the joy in her face was a privilege. Sadly, according to recent reports, this is not the case for hundreds and thousands of mothers. It should not be so. We should be ashamed that it is so. For even one mother, we should be ashamed. But it is so for thousands, according to the reports already mentioned. I was fortunate to be a part of a team of professionals, midwives, obstetricians, anesthetists, neonatologists, and others, who were all committed to provide the best possible care, personalized care, to all mothers and their babies. We never lost a mother for 3 decades, had a zero tolerance to intrapartum stillbirths. Our weekly perinatal meetings were mandatory for all to attend, and made sure that adverse events were fully discussed and learned from and never repeated. The government believes, and so was mentioned by the noble and distinguished Baroness Cumberledge, that the NHS was one of the safest places in the world to give birth. Minister, it was. Our maternity service in the past were, where others came to learn from. Why were our maternity units regarded as the best? Because as now, my lords, dedicated professionals provided and took pride in doing so, a safe, compassionate care to mothers and their babies, and importantly, were left alone to get on to do so. Multiple reports from CQC, as already mentioned, and independent investigations of several maternities in England have shown that care is not safe, resulting in unacceptably high levels of harm to mothers and their babies. We all know there are more such reports to come. Whilst workforce shortages, pressures of work, lack of communication, lack of poor governance are all cited as possible problems, and they undoubtedly are and need to be addressed, I believe the genesis of the long-standing problems are deeper and go further. Therefore, I support absolutely the plea made by Baroness Cumberledge for a new beginning for the maternity services. The response from the government and organizations responsible for delivery of maternity services to adverse report is to produce more documents of what they will do, set up task force, workforce plan that may deliver in 5 or 10 years, safety organization, 3-year plans, long-term plans, and much more. Plans that lack implementation plans or regular outputs to demonstrate success. Quality of maternity services, my lords, are a bellwether for the standards of the quality of service in the rest of the NHS. Levels of maternal and perinatal deaths are good indicators of quality of maternity services, as evidenced by several of the investigations. In this respect, as already mentioned, the latest maternal mortality report is a cause for concern in many ways. Confidential inquiries, my lords, in maternal deaths were formally established in 1954, although its predecessor existed from 1928, and it is the world's longest-running successful audit system of healthcare. It is a good barometer of a performance of the maternity service. The latest report from Embrace, as mentioned, of deaths between year 20 and December 22 showed the rate of maternal death was 13.14 deaths per 100,000 maternities, highest over the last 2 decades, much higher than rate of 8.79 in the years 2017 to 2019 cohort. Even after removing deaths due to COVID-19, the rate is significantly higher than 17 and 19-year cohort. UK now has one of the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world, compared to Norway's 2.79, Germany's 4, which, by the way, has remained static for 20 years, and France 6. We are way behind. Main causes, and these are important, are thromboembolic disease, and that requires a clear strategy of how we're going to reduce those, because that has remained the number one cause now for decades. And I urge those professionals, the Royal College of Midwives, general practitioners, obstetricians, and psychiatrists, to come together to produce a clear guidelines how these deaths will be reduced. The next is cardiac disease. They are preventable. And importantly, and very tragically, my lord, are suicide deaths. These are vulnerable women whose mental health condition is not difficult to recognize during antenatal period. They are women who might be abused in the house. They are women who are further abused when they take home a baby. And we should not, as a society or as professionals, fail them, but we are. 39 suicidal deaths are tragic deaths. All maternal deaths are tragic, but these are particularly so. And they're preventable. And we should address that. Maternal deaths also show up gross inequalities related to ethnicity and deprivation, as already been mentioned several times. Black mothers have 4 times the risk, Asian mothers twice the risk, and mothers from deprived population had twice the risk. These are not a new surprise findings, as already mentioned by the Nobel Baroness Taylor of Bolton. Inequalities in care and outcomes are well documented for a long time. Government has produced plans to try and reduce this, but none have showed any results. Can the Noble Lord the Minister say which of the plethora of initiatives to reduce harm and deaths, to reduce inequalities in maternal health, has had any effect? What benefits have been derived from work of Maternity Inequalities Oversight Forum, the Maternity and Neonatal Care National Oversight Group, Maternity Disparities Task Force, and several other initiatives in reducing inequalities, deaths of mothers and babies, and improved maternity services? What we do reported reports of high-profile organizational failures. That is what we do know. Soaring clinical negligence claims, huge variations in outcomes and culture of care, workforce challenges, inequalities in care and outcomes linked to ethnicity and deprivation, rising maternal and perinatal deaths, serious safety issues to the point that the regulator CQC says, and I quote, England's maternity units currently have the poorest safety ratings of any hospital services it inspects, end of quote. Does this not all add up to service that needs a radical reform? Isn't it time that we have a root and branch independent review of the maternity services that brings about the changes needed to have a world-class service that is compassionate, safe, and delivers world-leading outcomes for mothers and babies? Can the noble Lord the Minister say, why not such a review, as part of his answers to what difference all the initiatives so far are making to improving the service, with real figures to demonstrate it? I know he's fond of data as evidence.
My Lords, I enter this debate with some trepidation when you hear contributions such as the last from such a distinguished obstetrician. But I do want to thank my noble friend, Baroness Taylor, for introducing this debate, because for me, I want to echo what Lord Patel has said, that what happens in maternity services should be seen as a sort of bellwether for the rest of the NHS. The reports that members are referring to from the CQC are really quite shocking in terms of maternity services. But we do know that that throughout all of this time, this is a period when, for women who are pregnant, their view of what sort of confidence they can have in the services that they are relying on during pregnancy, and there's more than one. It's not just the midwife, it's the GP, it's whoever they see in community services, it's the it's all of the other services that prop up their eventual delivery and then post-delivery services that are under the microscope here, and that I would say during my period of chairing the Public Services Select Committee in this House, in virtually every inquiry, we came across women who felt almost their relationship had been defined during their pregnancy. And if it had been a poor experience, then that introduced to them anxiety, concern, and just a little bit of trepidation about how they would make sure that the health of them and their family in future was looked after. And so for me, I really wanted to intervene in this debate to try to tease that out a little bit more. I do want to thank all of the myriad of organisations who have written to us around this debate, but also the library. We are really privileged to have such high quality research and attention paid to us, and I think too often we take it for granted and forget to say thank you to them all for doing that. But all of the reports, all of the briefings highlight the issue, and again the Public Services Select Committee highlighted the issue of staffing and of leadership. And for me, staffing and leadership underpins this whole thing, that there is a crisis in staffing, there is a crisis in the skill mix that there needs to be to ensure a happy and successful pregnancy for mother and for baby. And there is certainly a crisis in leadership, that far too many people who were the good leaders have left, partly over COVID, partly because of the additional pressures and so on. And there really is, the workforce plan on its own is not the answer. As Lord Patel said, you can have plan after plan after plan and review after review, but without adequate implementation, then those plans are just glorified bits of paper on the shelf. I know well, because I worked with her in a charity that I chaired before she took up this role, the Chief Executive of Maternal Mental Health, of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance. And I've heard from her over the past 2 to 3 years the real challenges in this area. And I want to thank her team for the work that they've been doing and the briefing that I've benefited from, I have to say, over many months rather than just for this debate. But they too are now working much more on the inequalities that have been highlighted by most speakers today. Again, in the Public Services Select Committee, we looked at what COVID revealed to us, really, about our public services. And what was absolutely clear was that virtually none of them had understood the depth of the inequalities that there were in how public services responded to different racial and ethnic groups in our society. And I still don't think we have quite got hold of what we need to do there. As the Minister knows, I've been anxious about this in terms of vaccines and our preparation, our trials for vaccines and how far they include ethnic minorities, because actually there are different genetic needs, there are different cultural needs, and unless the workforce are sensitive and knowledgeable about that, and that means through their education and their training, they have to be enabled to be aware of that so that they can be sensitive to it when they are working with women from a different cultural and ethnic background to their own, then unless that happens, inequalities are virtually inevitable. And I do not think in how the government has approached this, they have been significantly sensitive to that, and that really does concern me. Other people have mentioned the reports from Embrace UK, which are really very stark, because they talk not just about the numbers, but they talk about the effect on the women of what their experience has been. And other people have talked about the numbers, so I'm going to keep my bit on numbers very short. But in and around 1 in 2 baby deaths, when looking at the care of black and white women whose babies have died, Embrace say that care was assessed as poor. 1 in 2. And they also found that if care had been better, it may well have prevented the baby from dying. And for around 3 in 5 mothers, care after their baby died was assessed as poor. And if it had been better, it may have meant bereaved mothers were likely to have been better supported in their physical and their emotional health. And in both groups, the white women they looked at and the black women they looked at, I'm going to leave talking about the Asian mothers to a later speaker, Baroness Gahir. I'm sure she will be. But in both groups that this report was around, the care was assessed as good in only around 1 in 5 of the deaths reviewed. This is about care, not necessarily about medical knowledge, about basic care. And that is something that, quite honestly, I'm a bit ashamed of, that we cannot do better and cannot support our workforce better so that they do better. But those disparities are huge. And if you think about attitudes, the identification by another charity, 5 times more, that use of offensive and racially discriminatory language, being dismissive of concerns, was too often the experience of Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. And also a poor understanding about the anatomy and physiology of Black women and a poor understanding of the clinical presentation of conditions in babies of Black women was a significant experience. And then the assumptions, racially based assumptions about pain tolerance, about education levels, and about the relational status of Black women. These are all issues in the basic care and the attitudes that are experienced. But most shockingly, mental ill health is the most common complication of pregnancy in the UK. And at least 1 in 5 women experience a mental health problem during pregnancy and after birth, and suicide is the main leading cause of maternal death in the postnatal period. Again, this is quite honestly shocking, and we need to be able to intervene much more appropriately, and midwives are ideally placed to ask sensitively about mental health in the routine contacts that they have with the women, but too often that simply does not happen. And again, I come back to the fact that this is the time in women's lives when she will have the most interactions with healthcare professionals. And so this is the time to make sure that mental health becomes a normal way of working with women when they present. I mean, you know, I don't see pregnancy as an illness, but when they present to healthcare professionals, in whatever sense, mental health, attention to mental health has to be part of how they are handled. So, I'm really trying to say that there are lots of things that we know the government need to do. They need to get on and do it, rather than continually, that's where I disagree with some of the speakers. It's not more reviews, it's actually making sure we get on and improve the services in the way so many of us have been told they need improving.
My Lords, I wish to draw attention to my registered interests in healthcare and thank Baroness Taylor for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. Her speech was absolutely laser-focused analysis of the current situation and summarised many of the issues that I will return to without, I hope, too much repetition. The current state of maternity services in England is of concern to many stakeholders. However, this must be put in context. Most expectant mothers and their significant others receive high-quality care during pregnancy and are delivered of healthy babies. Yet the CQC report rates 10% of maternity services as inadequate and 39% as requiring improvement. This margin of error in such a vital service is really concerning. Shockingly, safety and leadership remain particular areas of concern, with 15% of services rated as inadequate for safety and 12% inadequate for being well led. My Lords, I think we can all agree that this is an unacceptable failure of the women, their partners and babies in this country. Of particular note is the fact that poor provision is disproportionately failing many mothers from minority ethnic groups, as others have outlined, but also white women who suffer economic deprivation. Many factors contribute to this situation, and I believe part of it might be that there has been less regard for the profession in the last decade that there was. I remember coming to the end of my general nurse training, just 500 yards down the road, and being asked what I was going to do next. And I said I wanted to do mental health nursing. And I so remember the sister tutor saying to me, "But you're bright enough to be a midwife." And I think we should just hold on to that. I'm happy to tell you that I got an obstetric certificate so that I could work abroad, and ended up as a mental health sister with mother and baby unit in that ward, so actually used it wisely. Midwives are now men and women, and we don't seem to have recognised that in some of our structures in multidisciplinary teams. With men, we hoped that it would improve the provision of employment for midwives, as well as double the amount of people that we could recruit the pool from. But actually, that doesn't seem to be working as well as we might have hoped. So, quite frankly, most multidisciplinary teams face large, unmanageable caseloads and have to work with what in some areas are unsafe staffing ratios, and to my mind, often do not receive fair compensation for their important work. As commended by the CQC 2023 report, midwives and staff on maternity wards go above and beyond when possible to provide the best care. However, services are being pushed to breaking point. As has already been acknowledged, it is estimated by the Royal College of Midwives that we have 2,500 full-time vacancies. This obviously leads to overload, understaffing in some areas, and the quality of care is put under threat. This is recognised in the 2023 NHS England 3-year delivery plan for maternity and neonatal services, which highlights that supporting the workforce to develop skills and extra capacity is vital to provide future high-quality care. Now, I want to put this in context. When I went off to do my mental health nursing as a second qualification, I was paid as a staff nurse. And now it is almost impossible to get a second qualification without going back on a bursary. I just leave that for people to think about. I therefore support the commitments that have been made to ensure that trusts will meet staffing levels and achieve full rates for midwifery by 2027-28. But it remains very difficult for a registered nurse to do a shortened course to become a midwife. However, I therefore would suggest that women will continue to face what some do now, which is hurried care, with staff having little time to provide truly personal-centred support. My lords, I and many other contributors to today's debate have their own children and know that good health during pregnancy, labour and postnatally is vital, and so is good health care. So if you don't start with good health and then you have poor health care, that's a pretty difficult situation. Staff need time to listen to mothers and fathers and to act when concerns are identified. As I have told this House before, with my first child, I felt ill. My husband came to visit me in the hospital the day she was born. And apparently, and I don't remember this, I grabbed his hand and said, "You will look after this baby if I die." And he said, then he realised he should go and talk to somebody because this was not the way I normally talked about things. And I had fantastic, fast intervention and had my baby within half an hour, who I'm pleased to tell you is now a taxpayer. So that was a good, cost-effective solution. But too often, people do not listen to significant others who sometimes understand very well what mothers are saying, and we therefore can't entirely
rests the whole responsibility on the mother in a time of distress. It's necessary, I would suggest, to think seriously about access to interpreters on a 24-hour rota system, so that women who are unable to speak or understand English because it is not their first language can be assisted in communicating with the staff caring for them. We have got situations where it is impossible to get an interpreter in some areas, and that makes the situation really difficult both for the midwives and the mother, and you cannot always rely on an ad hoc relation interpreting what's really going on. So I do want to ask the Noble Lord the Minister, can he comment on how access to interpreters is monitored with the NHS, and if this is not being undertaken, can he ask the government to make provision to do so? And this is particularly important, I've been informed, in genetic counselling within families from different cultures to the midwives involved. Staff are often unhappy due to pressure at work, in part associated with the low levels of staffing, but also, as other noble lords have said, because senior midwives are retiring or retiring earlier than planned for a variety of reasons. Many are leaving specialists mid-career whose skill set cannot be easily replaced, particularly in terms of supervising student midwives. Now, I just want to say that I'm really proud. The daughter who's the taxpayer is a teacher, but teachers get rewarded on top of their salaries for supporting student teachers if they're the lead in it. So there's an example of something we could learn from. Retention issues reportedly stem in part from inflexible working practices. Flexible working is difficult to manage in a 24-hour, 7-day service. I know, I've tried it. But some trusts have much better retention than others. So how can best practice be shared and replicated to retain midwives across the NHS services? The stress of unmanageable expectations is work is creating burnout, as some others have reported, and encouraging some midwives to leave the profession. Perhaps we should think about a structure for sabbaticals for some midwives. Midwifery is at the best of times hard physical and emotional labour, and I think we don't always recognise that. When things go well, you get the rewards that my honourable friend Lord Patel has just spoken about, but when things go badly, it can be very devastating. Capacity is being undermined by a lack of investment in continued staff development. This is highly worrying as we face an increase, as others have said, in complex births, as more women are giving birth over the age of 35, as I did. Maternal diabetes has increased, the use of induction and caesarean has increased, and preterm births are becoming more common. These cases require specialist skills so that mothers and babies are safe. However, a lack of training and development opportunities for midwives, both men and women, can lead to a skill deficit that is vitally needed for our specialist service to survive in the future. My point is that midwives need to be skilled at recognising complications in pregnancy and ensuring that they pass those midwives to other members of the multidisciplinary for assessment so that, wherever possible, early intervention can be undertaken. The vast majority of our student midwives in England are reporting having to take on additional debt over and above the loans available to students to cover their basic costs. This is undoubtedly putting people off coming into midwifery, and the National Union of Students report a worrying drop in application to university courses from 13,500 in 2021 to just over 10,000 in 2023. I ask the Noble Lord the Minister, will the government consider the NHS undertaking loan repayments for university fees after, say, 3 or 5 years NHS service, which would aid retention of midwives, nurses, and indeed junior doctors, as well as others professions allied to medicine. Our midwives work tirelessly to provide the best care they can, but they're often unable to do so because of the issues highlighted by other noble lords and my own points. We must ensure that these issues are tackled so that every woman is provided with truly personal-centred, skilled, compassionate care, and that all babies have the best possible start. The Royal College of Nursing have produced nursing workforce standards that could apply to paediatric intensive care units, and similarly, the Royal College of Midwives has provided evidence on the necessary rates of midwives to expectant mothers at different stages of pregnancy. Is this government prepared to consider legislation on workforce standards in the NHS in future?
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Baroness Taylor for initiating this debate with her usual thoroughness and elegance. I think if the recommendations made by Baroness Cumberledge were all implemented, we could go home now. And Lord Patel nearly made me cry. But I think that this is a very important subject. I'm glad it's being debated. I hope that even with all the other difficulties that the health service are faced, that the noble Lord the Minister will take on board the vast experience that there is in this chamber on this subject. When I was a non-executive director at King's College Hospital Foundation Trust, we were fortunate to have Cathy Warwick as the lead for maternity services. Directors were kept well informed about what was happening, and I understand from various CQC reports that that good practice does not exist. I will cover items about the pay structure, those who experience birth trauma of severe kind, and a little bit about the deterioration in maternity care, but that has been well covered, so I will reduce that section. Now, I believe the NHS pay dispute was avoidable, and their origins go back to the clumsy and arrogant stance taken by previous health secretaries. One health secretary took the junior doctors on some years ago and beat them. Ministerial memories may be short, but junior doctors have longer memories. Whether they're badly led or well led doesn't matter. The strength of feeling is still there. And I want to refer to the government's consultation on creating a new pay scale for nurses and midwives. Having had experience of this, I would caution the government against any separation for a number of reasons. The agenda for change pay structure, carefully negotiated over a long period of time, is underpinned by the NHS job evaluation scheme, and this determines the levels at which all healthcare professionals are paid. Separation of the nurses' pay structure would divide and rule, which in the long term is irresponsible. It wouldn't lead to more money or more midwives. It wouldn't help with the chronic retention problem, and most importantly, it will lead to equal pay claims and a serious risk of unplanned extra costs. This isn't a theoretical view. When I first arrived at ACAS, I was faced with over 500 equal pay claims from ACAS staff. This caused a great deal of amusement from my previous TUC General Counsel colleagues when they heard I'd got the job of chair. This was in the days of a Labour government, so I'm not making a party political point on this subject of pay structures. The problem had arisen because of the breakup of the civil service negotiating structures and the separation of grading by government departments and non-departmental public bodies. ACAS as an organisation, faced with this problem of 500 equal pay claims, were faced with sclerosis, low staff morale, and risk being a laughing stock because it was supposed to solve employment relations problems, not be the centre of them. It was clearly a priority for the ACAS Council and the new Chief Executive to solve. And I won't go into the details of how it was done. Why give away trade secrets? But it cost us £10 million. We were given the money by government, but exactly the same amount was taken off us the following year. Subsequent redundancies cost us hundreds of staff and thousands of years of experience. Compared with the number of nurses and midwives, that cost is small beer. I urge the government to think very carefully before they leave such chaos behind. The Noble Lord the Minister will no doubt be aware of the all-party parliamentary group on birth trauma and its recent launch of a parliamentary inquiry on birth trauma. It's co-chaired by Rosie Duffield MP and Theo Clark MP and will be assisted by the charity Birth Trauma Association. Its stated aim is to collect evidence so that government can take practical and achievable steps to improve care and support for new mothers and their partners and incorporate birth trauma into the women's health strategy. The stories told by some women of their experience are horrifying, and the physical and mental trauma suffered by some are often unrecognised by the very professionals who should know better. A relative of mine gave birth to 2 children, and the effect on her was shattering. Her mental health did not recover for 2 decades. She spent months in a mental health institution after each birth. This might have happened in any circumstances, but recognition of the dangers and the right information and preparation might have led to a different outcome. And recent CQC inspections reveal that maternity units are failing women, and the figures have already been stated. According to the Birth Trauma Association, some women who've had a dreadful experience find they're not listened to. Complaints are met with attempts to minimise the women's trauma and deny responsibility, they say. Frequently, the BTA was the first organisation to listen to women's accounts and acknowledge their trauma. A common feature is the failure to acknowledge pain levels. And in a recent television drama series, 2 of the regular male doctor characters were challenged to take a test to experience similar levels of pain to those experienced by women in childbirth. The test went from mild to severe, and they were only halfway up the painometer before they pleaded for it to stop. Now, I know it was a drama, although we've learnt how powerful dramas can be in different circumstances. Indeed. But it clearly illustrated a point which women have been making for centuries, and I should say, please don't try this at home. Will the Noble Lord the Minister ensure that his department studies the results of the APPG inquiry when it is published and take steps to improve things? Finally, the CQC's 2022 maternity survey, designed to assess the quality and safety of maternity services in England, received over 20,000 responses, and experiences of maternity care as has been said, have deteriorated, particularly over the last 5 years. The issue of availability of staff, confidence and trust, and communications and interactions with staff have already been outlined. I should emphasise, as Baroness Cumberledge did, that the majority of respondents were satisfied, but sometimes it's now a very narrow majority. For instance, in-hospital care after birth showed a worrying 57% of respondents said they were always able to get help. And the Royal College of Midwives has described the impact, as my noble friend Lady Warwick has also said, of the staff shortages on women as stark and sobering. And she's already mentioned the shortage of 2,500 midwives. Now, up to now, the government has said it has no plans to commission a public inquiry into the future of maternity services, despite the fact that it has been suggested by the Maternity Safety Alliance and Mumsnet. And I'd like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister, finally, in what circumstances would the government change its mind about public inquiry?
Declaring my interests as set out in the register, particularly that I am the CEO of Muslim Women's Network UK, and in that role I published a maternity report in 2022 titled Invisible Maternity Experiences of Muslim Women from Racialised Minority Communities. And I thank Noble Lady Baroness Taylor of Bolton for securing this very important debate, because despite the many research reports that we've had and inquiries, we are still waiting for a step change in the improvement of maternity care. I will mostly focus my comments on maternity disparities of minority ethnic women, data training and accountability. Data is crucial to really understand inequalities. However, when maternity data is often broken down by ethnicity, it is usually done so into broad groups such as Black, Asian and White, which masks the inequalities amongst different subgroups who then remain invisible and continue to have poor outcomes. For example, Arab women are rarely spoken about, but the research that I conducted found that they have poor outcomes comparable to other minority ethnic groups. In the South Asian group, Bangladeshi women tend to have the poorest outcomes. Amongst Black women, I found that Black African women and mixed race women tend to have the poorest outcomes. I also have concerns about poor outcomes for women from, for example, Eastern European background. So I think it is also important to break down the white group further. In this group, women with lower educational levels, single mothers and very young mothers are also likely to have poor outcomes. In other words, women who have less of a voice. So I want to ask my Noble Lord the Minister, when will the government have a detailed strategy that responds to the inequality experienced in each group? One way of responding to inequalities more quickly, rather than just wait for data sets which can take time to produce and analyse, is to use feedback from the complaint system. However, research and even hospital complaints data often shows that there is a low level of complaints from particular groups, certainly from minority ethnic groups. So I want to ask my Noble Lord the Minister, what action is the government taking to ensure that families are aware about the complaints procedures, and how will they have the confidence in that service? Given the poor experiences of minority ethnic women, one would expect them to be overrepresented in maternity litigation data, which would help to indicate where the risks are for them. And if they are underrepresented, it would indicate that they are not being compensated for the harms that are being caused to them. I decided to investigate this issue during my research, so I put in a Freedom of Information request to the NHS Resolution, the body that deals with claims of compensation on behalf of NHS England, and apparently works to resolve concerns and share learning and improvement. I was shocked to receive the following response in 2021. And they said, and I'm going to quote, "In terms of ethnicity breakdown, this information is not held as it is not recorded in our claims management system." This was astonishing, given that ethnicity data is routinely collected by the NHS and crucial for identifying inequalities between different groups. This perhaps is one of the clearest examples of systemic discrimination by the NHS. I have since had letter exchanges with the CEO of NHS Resolution and asked for ethnicity data to be recorded. The response has been positive, and I have been told that the data management systems are being upgraded to now record all protected characteristics. However, I have been informed that it may be a voluntary option, and which is likely to result in low data capture. But this data can be pulled in from hospital records. It's routinely collected. I have also been informed that data and trends will only be shared internally for learning. So, how will the public then identify trends and hold the NHS to account? So, could I have assurances from my noble Lord the Minister? Will he ensure NHS Resolution collects protected characteristic data from the hospital management systems rather than on a voluntary basis, and this information is made available to the public? This would help to identify inequality amongst different groups for all types of medical negligence claims, not just maternity claims. Next, I want to address training. Although workforce shortages will no doubt contribute to poor healthcare, staff attitudes and poor maternity care, many maternity research report findings provide clear evidence that a culture exists amongst some midwives and obstetricians of being desensitised to women's pain and of having negative attitudes towards women, which is even more pronounced for women from racialised minority communities. How does the government plan to address the issue of patient engagement and cultural competency training? Can't say the word. Having served on a hospital board, I know that if a maternity ward is short-staffed, they will not have the time to undergo such training. Also, the UK has large numbers of doctors and nurses recruited from abroad. Their culture of patient care is likely to be different. Here I am referring to non-medical aspects of patient care. Would the noble Lord the Minister agree that some kind of approved patient communication training should be mandatory for recruits from abroad? Finally, I want to finish by asking, has the government pulled together the many recommendations made by numerous maternity reports, such as Birthrights, 5 times more, and including the one that I authored, ensuring the recommendations are being implemented? The government's women's health strategy does not adequately deal with many health inequalities for women, and also for minority ethnic women in particular, including maternity disparities. I think more needs to be done there. I think the strategy needs to be strengthened. I therefore urge the government to appoint an independent maternity commissioner from outside of the NHS to provide scrutiny and hold all agencies to account, which would benefit all women. We have commissioners for many other areas. In maternity services, too many babies and mothers are dying or end up with poor outcomes, which can have lifelong consequences. Will my noble Lord the Minister agree to such an appointment of a maternity commissioner?
My Lords, it is a pleasure to follow the very important speech of the noble Lady Baroness Gohier, and her words reflect what I was hearing last night at a meeting with the Justice for Windrush generations, where there was reflections that minoritised communities share the experience of inequality and discrimination, but the individual experience of different communities is different and needs to be acknowledged. Now, I thank the noble Lady Baroness Taylor of Bradford for securing this debate, and also for reminding me of a meeting I attended in Huddersfield in 2016, which was 480 people stretched across 2 meeting rooms with hundreds of people outside unable to get into the room. That was the Hands Off Huddersfield Royal Infirmary campaign. And I note, actually, in looking around today, there's a book just out, Fighting from the Heart by Cormac Kelly, that recounts that campaign. And that's going to pick up one of the themes of my speech, which is we've been focusing absolutely rightly on listening to individual patients, but we also need to listen to communities and the demands that communities make of their maternity services. And I think Huddersfield Royal Infirmary, the case of what's happened there, is a real example of that. Now, I'm perhaps quite unusual in this debate in that I neither bring personal experience or professional experience. So I put the topic out around the Green Party to collect people's views and experiences. And one of the ones that came back that shocked me a little bit, and I'm going to anonymise this because I'm referring to a member of staff, but this member of staff reflected on her personal experience. A professional woman in London, you would expect well-equipped to navigate through the system. But her experience was that she didn't have the NICE recommended number of antenatal appointments, and as a result of that, a serious issue was missed. Now, that, I think, reflects on an individual level what we're hearing from all of the Royal Colleges, etc., about the inadequacy of services and all the statistics. And coming back to the community point, a Green Party Birkenhead and Tranmere councillor, Amanda Onwumanay, who is herself a former midwife, drew my attention to the current perilous situation of the Liverpool Women's Hospital, which is threatened with closure. The alternative accommodation and services that are being proposed do not match that are being lost in maternity and other services. And the NHS and the women of Merseyside are being shortchanged again. Now, I want to look at what's happening there because it's a reflection of something we haven't talked about very much. The issue of PFI, private finance initiatives, the privatisation of the NHS, and how that has cut away at resources, and that's reflected in what's happening in Liverpool in other places. And the concern is that a particularly quality service is at risk of being lost. And that also reflects what, again, is happening in London, where the NHS North Central London is consulting on the potential of closing one of two maternity services in London hospitals due to fewer births. These are the Whittington and the Royal Free. Now, if someone from outside London looks at a map, and you might look at those two and think, well, they're not very far apart. But anyone who knows this area, and I do well from previous political campaigning, will know that the public transport provision across, heading east-west across London, is extremely poor. People can frequently have to take 3 different buses to get from the east of what's the Whittington's catchment area to the Royal Free. And people need local services, and that's something that really must not be lost. And I quote Mayani Muthuvello from the Whittington Maternity and Neonatal Voices, who told BBC London that there's a real sense of reassurance of giving birth in a hospital near to where family and friends live, and that travelling to a facility further away adds to pressure on patients. So what we're seeing is not just the overall quality of service issues, but an issue of loss of local services. And I think it's worth contrasting this with looking at the government's own words in commenting this month on the Women's Health Strategy for England. And that's focused on expanding women's health hubs. It's focused on, indeed, it rightly says, focused on maternity care, continuing to deliver the NHS England's 3-year delivery plan for maternity and neonatal services. And so the government has plans for this, but we're really not seeing the kind of outcomes, as we've heard from so many other noble lords, that we were actually desperately needing. And I do want to pick up the points that the noble lady Baroness Gohier said, because the figures are really deeply shocking. And these are grouped figures because those are the figures that the NHS provides, but I'm relying in part on the briefing from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. Women from black ethnic backgrounds were 3 times more likely to die during or up to 6 weeks after pregnancy, and Asian women twice as likely. And deaths from mental health-related causes, as many noble lords have highlighted, it would count for nearly 40% of the deaths occurring within the year of an end of pregnancy. And a direct question here for the noble lord, the Minister, as the Royal College is calling for, will the government commit to a time-limited target to reduce maternal inequalities, to drive the innovation, improvement and, crucially, investment that's needed in these areas? Now, I want to pick up a point, briefly pick up a point made by the noble lady Baroness Watkins, because I think it is terribly important. There is no doubt that the serious major issues we're seeing in the outcomes of maternity services reflects more broadly the poor level of public health across our entire population. And this is where I run into the Green Party problem, is that everything's related to everything else. when you bring systems thinking in, you need to talk about everything and think about everything. But if we're talking about maternal health, we have to talk about things like people's working hours, people's commuting time. Are people able to work from home? Do people get the breaks and the kind of working conditions that they need to have a healthy pregnancy, a healthy birth, and provide healthy care for their baby? And just looking around these issues, I was looking at a really interesting study from the University of Swansea about how counterintuitively, during the pandemic, the biggest period of lockdown to the pandemic, when there was actually real shortages in the provision of services, probably unavoidably, but actually they found in Wales that rates of breastfeeding and levels of breastfeeding, successful breastfeeding, length of wet breastfeeding, actually went up. And this is where we need to look at that social setting, that if people are able to work from home, if people are at home, if people have less commuting time, they're able to spend more time with a newborn, then you actually end up with healthier outcomes. And we all know, whilst we have to acknowledge that breastfeeding cannot and will not work for everybody, the health outcomes are crucial to encourage that as much as we can for both mothers and babies. Now, I'm sure pretty well all noble lords have received the predictable, perhaps, but important flood of briefings before this debate. Mumsnet, the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Obstetrician and Gynaecologists that I've already referred to, Baby Lifeline, SANS, and the Care Quality Commission its own. And what they all stress is the huge problems with the workforce, particularly people not being trained, people having to be trained under conditions of extreme debt, and of course the number of people leaving the professions, particularly that of midwives. And I'm reminded of a trainee midwife who I spoke to just as the change was being made that midwives would be found loaded down with debt, would be paying for their own training. Now she was, as is often the case, doing a second degree. She'd done one degree, had worked, had a couple of children and decided to retrain as a midwife. And she was speaking about her own experience of being a trainee midwife in a birth suite where, tragically, there had been an unexpected stillbirth. And it happened that all of the fully qualified professionals in that room were occupied with medical things. And she found herself comforting the mother who had just had an unexpected stillbirth. Now, I find it obscene that people are having to now pay fees to be doing something like that as they're completing their training. I don't think that's acceptable. Now, just some more on that debt point. 3/4 of the student midwives, and this is from the Royal College of Midwives briefing, 3/4 of the student midwives in England surveyed expect to graduate with debts of more than £40,000. Just 1% expect to graduate with less than £5,000 of debt. And about half, 47% of all student midwives in England have a job outside their training in order to earn money. And that job is unexpectedly having a negative impact on their training. That cannot be acceptable. That cannot be setting people up for a long time, secure, stable career in midwifery. And of course, what we're seeing, and I'm referring here to the SANS briefing, who quotes a midwife, what we're seeing is that the lack of staff puts more pressure on the existing staff, and then more people leave, then the lack of staff puts more pressure on. And I want to quote the words here: staff are frightened to work in an understaffed, under-resourced unit for fear of mistakes or incidents occurring due to the high level of activity and understaffing, fear of investigations as a consequence, and fear for their mental health and well-being as a result. This is what we are doing to our midwives. And just one financial point, drawing on the Mumsnet briefing. The fact is that the government paid out £2.6 billion in the past year as a result of failures in the NHS in maternity and neonatal care. It's costing us enormously, and it's costing us financially. And I just want to circle back to my initial point about the importance of local facilities and women's facilities and listening to communities. I looked up historic England, thinking about the situation in Liverpool, and the first women's hospitals appeared in the 1840s, and there were 12 by 1871. Many people may know of the site, no longer there, of the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson founding the new London Hospital for Women on the Euston Road. We've been through a cycle, several cycles. We had, in early modern times, female midwives that, by the standards of the time, provided good quality of care. We then saw the arrival of male midwives that actually saw more deaths. We then saw, in Victorian times, the upswelling of women's services. We're now at risk of losing them again. This is a cycle we need to break.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to be taking part in this debate today, and can I thank my noble friend for her introduction of the debate and indeed the very balanced way that she did that. I need to declare an interest as the maternity safeguarding non-executive member of the Whittington Hospital Board, and also, of course, in my day job as the Shadow Women and Equalities spokesperson here, both of which, of course, will inform my contribution today. But I want to just say that my life and possibly my son's life might have been lost without maternity services when he was born 37 years ago at the Homerton. He was, I think, the 5th baby born there because it was a brand new hospital. The midwife and I were wandering around trying to work out where the light switches were and things. But, you know, they saved our lives. Without doubt, 100 years ago, we'd both have died. And so I do think we need to recognise the great progress that there's been in antenatal and natal care in the UK and in our NHS. And I was particularly moved by the Noble Lord Patel's contribution and the importance of that contribution, which of course is reflected, for instance, in the Ockenden report, is the need for multidisciplinary teams in our maternity units. So we're not just talking about midwives, we're also talking about the role of people like the Noble Lord and our gynecologists. And I do meet amazing and dedicated midwives in the course of my work as a non-executive at the Whittington Hospital. And they are all too aware of the challenges that they face because there is a desperate need for more resource, better staffing. In the case of the Whittington, we are an old hospital, some bits of it built in Victorian times, including the entrance to our maternity unit, which I might think might still have the lying-in place in it. And as a noble lady, Baroness Cumberledge, will bear testament, because she very graciously came and opened a new birthing suite for us about a year or so ago. We're having to adapt our facilities all the time. But one of the things that I am absolutely sure of is the change in culture that is still required in the NHS, which is to place the value on maternity services that they do on other medical conditions. And, you know, I was conscious that maternity didn't feature as often as it should have done, as high as it should have done in our governance arrangements in our hospital. It does now. But that was something I think that probably is writ large amongst our hospitals right across England. As my noble friend Baroness Taylor said, the core of the challenges outlined by Ockenden and by the CQC reports are, of course, staffing. And the Royal College of Midwives, in their briefing note, make all the relevant points about 2,500 midwives missing, that, you know, we need to improve retention of experienced midwifery staff, as well as increasing the number of newly qualified midwives. And also we need to place real value on the maternity services that we have. But there is no doubt that some of our maternity services have failed women and families. And it's important that, of course, those lessons are learnt and we make sure that those mistakes do not happen again. And indeed, we need to eliminate the stark, persistent, unacceptable disparities in the maternity death rates suffered by black women, Asian women, as well as women from some of our most deprived areas. As very eloquently described by the Noble Lady Baroness Goher in her contribution. And I absolutely agree with the Noble Lady about the need for collecting data, because having been involved in equalities work for a very, very long time, that's 40-odd years, if you don't monitor and you don't have the data, you cannot know where the discrimination is taking place, and you cannot show where deeply rooted discrimination is embedded in our systems, and you have to collect that data. And I have to say that this government has not always done that, and indeed has stopped funding occasionally the need to collect that data. And turning very briefly to black maternal health, I thought that the Commons report on women, black maternal health was absolutely vital to this debate. And indeed, I think I may have raised this as an issue with the Noble Lord the Minister at the time, when we did have an exchange which was about what were the roots of the fact that black and ethnic minority women, mothers were dying at a really starkly higher rate than white women. And we both, I think, probably agreed that part of it was the embedded racism in our maternity delivery services, and partly in the socio-economic reasons and deprivation in some of those communities. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to address this. And a report by the Muslim Women's Network said that black Muslim women, especially black African women, were most likely to receive poorer standards of care, followed by South Asian women, particularly Bangladeshi women. And the Commons report noted that the themes included, as the Noble Lady Baroness Goher says, a gap in data and information collection on the needs, experience and outcomes of minority ethnic women, women not being listened to, women receiving care which was neglectful and which lacked dignity and respect. So those are some of the challenges, my lords, that we need to address, the difference in mortality rates that we face in our maternity services. And so, my lords, I think we have to also acknowledge, and I just want to put on the record, that we have to take urgent action to tackle what is acknowledged as systematic racism in UK maternity services. And it's always hard to say that when you've worked in public life as long as I have on equalities, but I think the Noble Lady Baroness Goher actually absolutely illustrated it. I'm shocked, but I did not know we were not collecting data on the enormous, on the claims and the financial implications of mortality, death and infant death. So, I want to turn to a more positive story in my final remarks. Because when you are working with a general integrated hospital at a local level, like the Noble Lady Baroness Taylor, we're both from Yorkshire, so I can say Bradford and Huddersfield, and these are the hospitals with which I was familiar at home. We know that it's important that those hospitals respond to the needs of the population which they serve. Of course they do, of course they have. So being an adopted Londoner and being a non-exec at the Whittington, I think that we have tried to address these issues in various ways. I want to mention some of those because I think they are important, because we're a local general hospital absolutely slap bang in the middle of the inner city, serving mostly the very mixed population of Islington and Haringey. And I think the first thing I want to say, by the way, I'm very proud of the fact that during COVID, all our births had attendants. We didn't stop birth attendants, fathers and relatives being present at the birth of the babies born in our hospital. Particularly proud of that, actually. But the specialist services that our midwives have to offer have to reflect the needs of our local population. And I am very impressed and hope that this will be a generalist remark, which is that the conditions and the varying conditions that present by pregnant women with epilepsy, diabetes, bipolar, sickle cell, that we have midwives who are specialists in those areas and that they need to be. Because these are conditions, my lords, which of course would actually have been a barrier to giving birth in the past or would have made it a very dangerous procedure. So in our part of London, we have a sickle cell unit in our hospital, which is a generalist unit of which we're very proud and which is a very specialist unit. And of course, it works right across into our maternity unit. And that's very important because we have mums coming in who have got sickle cell with all the problems that presents. And so the experience, for instance, as mentioned by the Noble Lady Baroness Watkins, to combine midwifery with other expertise, particularly sort of mental health services, is very important because for a woman who does have a serious mental health condition and having medication for that will need to be carefully monitored right through her pregnancy. So those specialities are very important indeed, to say nothing of the fact that sometimes mental health problems can assert themselves anyway as a result of the pregnancy. And the second thing I want to talk about is female genital mutilation, because as a local hospital, in 2000, we had to respond to the fact that we had a growing number of women presenting who were pregnant and who had suffered from female genital mutilation. And so the Whittington Hospital now has a female genital mutilation clinic. It used to be known as the African Well Women Clinic. It was established by a woman called Joyce Clark in 2000. And that clinic provides today services on FGM, counselling, antenatal care, assessment, defibrillation, which is reversal of FGM, post-surgery follow-up, postnatal follow-up. It not only presents that service in Islington and Haringey, but actually it's the whole of London, and there are women from all over the country who come to avail themselves of those important services. And the midwife who leads that is called Huda Mohammed. She trained as a midwife at the hospital, joined the FGM service in 2012, became our FGM lead in 2016, and it is such a highly regarded service nationally, and she has played such a crucial role in providing comprehensive and holistic approach to managing and raising the awareness of FGM and the significantly positive outcomes and benefits for the women who've undergone this procedure. She was given an MBE in the New Year's Honours List, and we're very proud of that.
My lords, like other noble lords, I congratulate the noble lady Baroness Taylor of Bolton for initiating this important debate and for her comprehensive introduction. It's a privilege, but it is, as has already been noted, somewhat daunting to speak in this debate amongst so many acknowledged experts and long-standing contributors in this area. The always excellent Lord's Library briefing already mentioned highlights an issue which has been raised by several noble lords across the House, that the experience of maternity services is not equal for everyone, and that, once again, already marginalised communities and those in less privileged situations report a poorer experience of maternity services. I want to use this opportunity to highlight the experience of another group who are not often included in these debates. That is the experience of maternity services in England for women with learning disabilities. The 2016 National Maternity Review set out NHS plans to improve maternity care and the care of people with learning disabilities. But despite this, the experience of maternity care for those women is still found to be consistently poorer than for the rest of the adult population. A learning disability affects the ways in which people understand information, the way they learn new skills, and the ways in which they communicate. It may also mean a reduced ability to cope independently. Learning disabilities are often unique to the individual and can present in many forms, some obvious and some more covert in nature. Of course, the general good principles of person-centred care apply to caring for people with a learning disability. But the challenges of pregnancy for women with learning disabilities, which include higher risks of perinatal complications and caesarean delivery, mean that midwives and other health professionals need particular skills and knowledge if they are to provide this person-centred care through pregnancy, childbirth and early parenthood. Without this specific skill set, their needs cannot be met. Significant emphasis needs to be placed on effective communication and the application of reasonable adjustments to prepare parents and offer them practical and emotional support through their path to parenthood. People with a learning disability need to understand their midwife, and they need a midwife who understands their needs and knows how to provide the right support. That midwife may also need to educate and support other health and social care professionals they encounter on their journey to do the same. The importance of continuity of care cannot be stressed highly enough when providing care to people with a learning disability. And equally important are the collaborative efforts of professionals to build a network of trust and care, which needs to be available throughout the parenthood journey beyond birth, to best assist parents in bringing up their child and avoid those regrettable cases when children of parents with learning disabilities are removed from their parents' care. Public Health England 2016 recommendations and the 2010 Equality Act state clearly that people with learning disabilities should be provided with reasonable adjustments. If adjustments are not put in place to accommodate the complex and diverse needs of pregnant women with learning disabilities, they may be subject to a system which just does not work for them. As one example, fast-paced appointments in which they're asked to absorb high levels of complex information and make informed choices at speed. Writing in the British Journal of Midwifery in 2019, Samantha Vernon reported the findings of her research internship at the National Institute for Health Research into maternity services for people with learning disabilities. Her interest stemmed from her own 19 years of clinical practice, in which she identified an increasing number of women with learning disabilities presenting for care in her trust, but she found no mention of learning disabilities in the 2019 NICE guidelines and no specific care pathway for women with learning disabilities. Among her conclusions, she recommends broader use of a passport for pregnant women with learning disabilities, a document prepared with the antenatal team that goes with them through their maternity journey to help all the health professionals they encounter understand the ways in which that person's learning disability affects their interactions with obstetrics and midwifery services. This would include critical information, including on reasonable adjustments, updated as appropriate, and it would reduce the need for patients to be questioned over and over again, thereby reducing stress and saving NHS time. I know that hospital passports are now recognised for use by people with learning disabilities, but it isn't clear how actively they are promoted in maternity services. Perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister could comment on that. Her other key finding, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that formal training on learning disabilities needs to be increased so that health professionals are able to recognise and support women with learning disabilities through pregnancy, childbirth and early years care. This aligns with MENCAP's research, which uncovered a patchy picture in which the number of hours devoted to this content and the level to which this learning is assessed varies widely. Their 2017 Treat Me Well campaign showed that 69% of registered nurses wanted more training about learning disabilities. And a qualitative study from Dr. Emma Castell, 2016, found midwives often felt inadequately equipped with the necessary skills and training to care for women who have learning disabilities. Now, these are some years back, and there have clearly been some improvements in the intervening years. In January last year, working with NHS England and supported by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the University of Surrey's Together project published a toolkit and guidelines to support the delivery of good practice in maternity services for parents with learning disabilities. This was based on existing research, best practice reviews, several interviews with health and social care professionals, parents with learning disabilities and their supporters and carers. It is a clear and accessible guide with practical and implementable evidence-based actions that can be taken. Could the Noble Lord the Minister confirm whether this toolkit is widely available across all maternity services? My Lords, people with a learning disability, including those who are pregnant, are protected by a legal framework which entitles them to reasonable adjustments so they can access services, adjustments to communication, support with decision-making, the right to a family life and dignity in care. And yet, their experience of providing training across several hospital trusts leads MENCAP to conclude that attitudes towards people with a learning disability can vary. They report that in some healthcare professions, including at senior levels, there are misunderstandings about what a learning disability is, lack of awareness about health inequalities, low awareness of the support required, the needs to adapt communication, and a need for guidance around the implications of and the responsibilities under relevant legislation, including deprivation of liberty safeguards. This last point is particularly important for midwives looking after women with learning disabilities, who need to be able to understand and apply the Mental Capacity Act, the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act to ensure the needs of the women in their care are met and their rights upheld. My Lords, the 2022 Women's Health Strategy sets out government's ambition for England to be the best place in the world to give birth through personalised, individualised and high-quality care. If this goal is to be achieved, training for midwives must equip them with the skills and competencies to support all women, including those with learning disabilities, through and beyond pregnancy and childbirth. In responding to this important debate, could the Noble Lord the Minister reassure the House that this training is taking place? And perhaps he can outline what steps government is taking to ensure that the rights of parents with learning disabilities to access maternity services free from discrimination, where their rights are expected and where they do receive high-quality, person-centred care, are being upheld.
My Lords, I'm also grateful to Baroness Taylor of Bolton for the debate and for all speakers whose points I will inform my contribution. Like Baroness Donaghy, I was moved by Lord Patel's description of a new mother's experience, which brought back memories of the birth of my twins across the river in St Thomas's, where the labour room actually has a splendid view of this building. And if I can offer a tip to partners who are there present during labour, it's that pointing out interesting features of the Palace of Westminster and taking photos may not endear yourself to the mother who is doing all the work. On a more serious note, it's good to be able to offer a belated, very public thank you actually to the staff at St Thomas's who were superb, particularly dealing with multiple births, which I know is a much more specialist and complex procedure. I'm also grateful to all Noble Lords for the expertise they've shared, and in my contributions I largely want to focus on the digital aspects, which is something that I do have more hands-on experience of than either medicine or giving birth. But I also want to pick up the point about the workforce and the student experience. And whilst my children, unlike Baroness Watkins, are not yet at the taxpayer stage, I'm observing them and their peers going through the process of making their higher education choices and the kind of calculations they make. And the debt figures that were presented by the Royal College of Midwifery and that we've heard from Baroness Bennett and others in the debate today are alarming. And it seems blindingly obvious that those debt figures are putting people off from going into the profession, that they are causing enormous stress for students during the process of learning, and that they're contributing to dropout rates, which are higher than any of us would like. So I do hope that the Noble Lord the Minister has something to offer in this area around how we can make sure that training to be a midwife, as well as training in other medical professions, is something that an 18-year-old, when they make those calculations, think is worth their while. However well motivated they are inside, you cannot ignore the economics of being saddled with huge amounts of debt. My first digital point is also a workforce point to a certain extent, and this is about the changing expectations of people as they come into the workforce. So having survived the training and the debt, now as you move into work, that has to be workable for the individual based on how they live their lives today. There's something, again, I think Baroness Watkins touched on earlier around scheduling and rostering and flexibility at work. It's an issue across the wider health and care workforce, but I think it's especially acute for those roles that are dependent on a safety-critical presence in the workforce. They're not roles that can be moved around. They're roles where people have to be present at a certain time on a certain date in certain numbers in order for the safety to be maintained. So really building on those points that Baroness Watkins made, this is really difficult for employers. They have to know that the right staff will be on site to cover each shift. There's no way around that. But where this leads to really inflexible rostering, then that can clash with other staff needs. And these may be other caring responsibilities, caring either for younger or older family members, but they can also be for personal goals like travel, goals that people do have now as they come into the workforce. They may look for these extended breaks. I think sabbaticals was mentioned. They may want a month to go travelling. That may be a reasonable expectation that people have today that they might not have had 15, 20 years ago. And where rostering systems do not allow sufficient flexibility, then staff may either leave the profession altogether, it just doesn't add up, or they may not accept a trust contract but move into agency work. And then the NHS ends up paying more for the same person to do the job simply because they didn't have the flexibility to take a month off. They've now moved to agency work from a full-time NHS contract, and that seems to me an absurd outcome. My Lords, we talk a lot about sort of whizzy technology like artificial intelligence these days, but what's needed here are much more straightforward, efficient scheduling systems that enable staff levels to be met while giving individuals more control over the way in which that rostering occurs. That's the expectation they have today. And also a willingness of trust management to change with the times and allow that flexibility to happen. I hope the Noble Lord the Minister can look into this question of how we could improve staff retention through improved rostering systems for all NHS staff, but particularly midwives in the context of today's debate. This is basic and cheap technology used well that could prove to be enormously beneficial in terms of a cost-benefit equation. The second area I want to touch on is that around information to mothers. And this comes out as a key area of concern for respondents to the CQC maternity survey, which is also referenced by Baroness Cumberledge. It's something that seems to be getting worse. That in this wonderful information age, we are finding that mothers are saying that the information provision that they get from the maternity services is getting worse. And that, again, seems to me to be extraordinary. A key tool in improving that is offering self-help systems where people can access information themselves. This is both better for those who prefer direct access to information, but it should also lead to improvements for those who want to talk to somebody directly, because it frees up staff time to be available for those who need that direct access. So self-help access to information about your own care, I think, is critical. It can also benefit in terms of some of the language issues, where, again, providing translation and interpretation at scale can be done more effectively when enabled by technology often than it can if you're reliant on getting somebody with a particular language into a particular location at a certain time. And I would also be very interested in the Noble Lord the Minister's thoughts on the points, I think, very rightly raised by Baroness Bull around accessibility. Again, that we want to make information available. It needs to be truly accessible to people, whether they have learning disabilities or any other particular requirement that means that a standard provision of language may not be as useful as something which is tailored to their needs. My Lords, the government recognised this need and they gave us a commitment. And again, we've heard in the debate today of people saying, well, we need more than commitments, we need action. Well, the commitment was very clear. In the NHS long-term plan, it said by 2023/24, which I think is now, all women will be able to access their maternity notes and information through their smartphones and other devices. And I'm quoting from the plan. So I really hope that the Noble Lord the Minister today can update us on where we are with this target and whether, again, we're likely to reach it and what issues are surfacing. And again, it's normal that things surface during that process of rollout, but I'd be ready to hear what issues are surfacing and what action the government is taking to address those. The third area I wanted to address was around maternity electronic health records. And I've been looking at this because of an alert that was issued by NHS England at the end of last year about one of the systems used for managing patient records across several of our NHS maternity units. They found that the system could overwrite records, which provides or produces significant safety risks. And here's an area where I want to praise NHS England and Baroness Watkins. As a board member, you can take this back to them, that the issue was picked up, due processes were followed, and an alert was issued to every trust that was using this system, warning them about it and making sure they put remedial measures in place. And I'd also like to thank the Noble Lord the Minister and his staff for producing a very comprehensive response to queries I made around this. But it did prompt questions about the information flows that happen in maternity care generally between GPs, hospital trusts' general systems, and these specialist maternity systems. It seems to me we've ended up with quite a complex jigsaw of different systems now handling those patient records, which makes life more difficult. I'd be interested in the Noble Lord the Minister's views on whether he thinks information is flowing effectively in the context of maternity services, given to say that we seem to have created often dedicated systems for maternity services that may not be connected into the other systems. And from a patient point of view, you want one view of your care. You want a view of your care before you became pregnant, a view of your care during pregnancy, and a view of your postnatal care to all be integrated. And yet I'm concerned that at present, because we have different systems, that integration may not be taking place. And I think that's especially a challenge because it's held by different entities. And it's a classic NHS challenge that different entities have gone off and bought their own bits of this jigsaw puzzle, and nobody is responsible, as far as I can understand it, for putting all of the pieces together. It's also interesting in this in the context of the questions that Baroness Goher raised about data collection, where I suspect that some bits of this jigsaw will be collecting the data that we're looking for, other bits may not, and yet because of the way in which the systems are structured, that may not be joined up. Which would be a real shame. I mean, there's one thing if we haven't collected it, it's quite something else if we have collected it but we can't use it because it's in the wrong bit and not being connected up to the right bit. So, my Lords, I appreciate hearing all the experiences the Noble Lords have brought to this debate, and I hope that my somewhat geeky contribution has also flagged some issues that could contribute positively to keeping up the standards of our maternity services. And, my Lords, if you find me on the terrace staring wistfully across the river at St Thomas's in future, you will know that I'm just having a moment.
My Lords, I want to start by congratulating my noble friend Baroness Taylor for securing this debate and for setting out the issues with her customary elegance and clarity for us to build further on. And as my noble friend said, in all of the briefings that we received in preparation for this debate, they have all referred to a very worrying situation. And if I might head this off at the pass, that they've also referred to the fact that COVID cannot be used as an excuse because the pressures have been building for more than some 10 years. Something I'm sure the Noble Lord the Minister will want to address. And as we have heard, despite both the government and the NHS having published various targets, programmes, strategies and action plans over the years to improve services with lots of different evidence bases to call upon, and also, very sadly, inquiries into circumstances when things have gone so tragically wrong, it is, unfortunately, we find that maternity is an example of how services have deteriorated under the watch of the government. And as my noble friend Baroness Armstrong said, even with all of these plans, and even with all of these targets and so on, without proper implementation, they do not deliver improvement. And within all of this, we also know that data is important. And I noticed in a response to a written question from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans last month, that the Minister explained that the most recently published data which measures progress against government targets in the National Maternity Safety Ambition coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and therefore is out of date. The Minister also said in his written reply that the Department is working to increase the frequency and timeliness of publications, and I'm sure the whole House would agree that that would certainly be welcome. But would the Minister agree that it is extremely difficult to deal with any issue, including that of maternity services, without knowing the facts of the challenge, something that has been raised with particular regard to inequalities by both my noble friend Baroness Thornton and also the noble lady Baroness Gohere. My Lords, the House will be aware of Labour's commitments to train 10,000 more nurses and midwives every year, along with long-term workforce planning across the NHS by reviewing training and looking at creating new types of health and care professionals that draw on a diverse skills mix. We are also committed to setting an explicit target to end the maternal mortality gap, which sees black women in the UK 4 times more likely to die whilst pregnant, giving birth, or as new mothers compared to white women. This will come partly from the aforementioned training of more midwives and health visitors, but also by incentivising continuity of care, something referred to by the noble lady Baroness Cumberledge from her experience in chairing the work that gave rise to the Better Birth report. And it will also come from improving course content on the presentation of illness and pain amongst different groups. I do hope that the contributions and expertise in your Lordship's House will continue to contribute to bringing these commitments to reality in terms of improvement. And, my Lords, as we have heard a number of times in this debate, the Care Quality Commission has reported a decline in positive maternity experiences in recent years. And the noble Lord Patel, described the health of maternity services as a bellwether for the health of our NHS. Well, it seems, as we have heard, that in our maternity services, we are now finding that we are well behind in the maternal mortality stakes. And it was not the case, but it is now. And I would also like to say, as other noble lords have said, how touched I was when the noble Lord Patel expressed his gratitude to thousands of mothers who allowed him to be part of their lives. Well, I am sure that those thousands of mothers would also wish to express their gratitude to the noble Lord Patel. The some 20,000 responses that came in for the CQC's annual maternity survey 2022, which my noble friend Baroness Donaghy referred to, showed that less women were being given the help they needed when they contacted a midwifery team. They were getting less help in hospital care after birth, and they were getting less help with postnatal care. It also showed less confidence and trust, and it also showed a reduction in the availability of appropriate advice and support when contacting a midwife or a hospital at the start of labour or whilst in the care of that hospital. Now, I would like, as other noble lords have done, to thank the whole of the staff team who are in the provision of maternity services. And as the noble lady Baroness Watkins said, so many of those staff go above and beyond, and that's something which is also confirmed by the CQC, and rightly so. But what is evident is that it is the external pressures upon them that get in the way of them doing the job they need to do, and it is on this that the government holds the levers. My Lords, the CQC has continued to raise concerns about the quality of maternity care in England over many years. And the annual State of Care report, most recently the one for 2021-22, In that, the regulator reiterates its ongoing concerns about both the safety and the ethnic inequality of maternity services, as well as the impact of poor training, poor culture, and poor risk assessments on people's care. And by September 2023, the CQC had inspected nearly 3/4 of maternity services and described the overall picture as one of a service and staff under huge pressure, warning that many patients were still not receiving safe and high-quality care. And most recently, in November 2023, around 2/3 of maternity units in England received a CQC rating of requires improvement or that it is inadequate in safety. And that compared to 55% in the previous year. My Lords, this is going in the wrong direction. And I would be interested to hear the Minister's response on this. We've heard much in this debate, and rightly so, about maternal mortality. And the latest data shows that between 2020 and 2022, it has increased to levels not seen since 2003 to 2005. And it is right, as noble lords have said, that even within this extremely concerning statistic, all is not uniform, because the case is far worse for women who live in the most deprived areas. They are more than twice as likely to die during pregnancy or up to 1 year afterwards than women living in the least deprived areas. In 2019 to 2021, 12% of the women who died were at severe and multiple disadvantage. And as we have heard, compared with white women, women from black and ethnic backgrounds are 3 times more likely to die during or up to 6 weeks after pregnancy, and Asian women are twice as likely. And the noble lady Baroness Gohere was right to say that this broad brush approach to definition masks the range and depth of inequalities, whilst the noble lady Baroness Bull was also right to point to the fact that inequality extends to those with learning disability. So perhaps I could ask the Minister whether there is work going on to produce much closer attention to the needs of groups and to break down the people within this, the nature of those within these groups, in order that we can reflect and respond to the reality of those with differing experience. We have heard today about the tragedy of many failures within the maternity services, and I can recall in the many statements that we've dealt with in this House the expression that of how devastating it is to look at this and to have to discuss them. But when I look most recently at the independent review of maternity services at the Nottingham University's Hospitals NHS Trust, which is ongoing, it is staggering that it required the concerns of local families, MPs and others over many years to be crying out about the quality and safety of maternity services in the area. This will be the UK's largest ever maternity services review, with around 1,700 families' cases reportedly being examined, with Donna Ockenden, who's in the lead, saying that the review will not report until September 2025 because, as she says, no one will thank us for doing a half-baked job, adding that there would also be a period of family feedback which could last until the start of 2026. This makes absolute sense, but it is worth asking about why it took so long for the investigations to actually begin. My Lords, just to say on staffing, and we've heard so much of this, staffing is absolutely key, and retention is what we need. In addition to this, my noble friend Baroness Thornton referred to multidisciplinary training, which is absolutely vital to cement the proper working practices that we need, and yet we find that so many cannot find the time to attend this training. I wonder if the Noble Lord the Minister could say what is being done to address this. In conclusion, the birth of a child, as we know, is a unique event. Mothers, babies, families, they all deserve the best. I hope that this debate and the work that may flow from it will deliver the improvements that we all need to see.
I too would like to add my thanks to Baroness Taylor for enabling us to have this debate today, and for all the contributions and the vast experience and expertise from the members here. I too was moved by the words of the mother that Lord Patel mentioned, and I think Baroness Merrin put it very, very well in terms of the thousands of mothers who have their thanks to add to Lord Patel. I'm not sure there's so many fathers who would add their thanks to Lord Allen for his advice, but I will take it should I be in that situation again, in terms of maybe not taking the photos of the scenery. But I would like to reassure this House that we are committed to ensuring that all the maternity services provide the safe and compassionate care. Most women, as many members have mentioned, do have a positive experience of the NHS maternity and neonatal services, and the outcomes have improved, with over 900 more families welcoming a healthy baby each year compared to 2010. However, all women should feel confident that they and their baby will be cared for safely, and where tragedies happen, that they will be well supported and treated with compassion. We therefore acknowledge that there are unfortunately times when that care that's been provided is not enough. The recent independent reports by Donna Ockenden on maternity services in Shrewsbury and Telford, Dr Bill Kirkott on maternity and neonatal services in East Kent, and previously Morecambe Bay, set out many examples of poor care over the years. The review into maternity care at Nottingham University Hospitals, chaired by Donna Ockenden, commenced in 2022, and as mentioned, we expect to see that report published at the end of September 25. We take those investigations and all elements of maternity safety incredibly seriously. We understand the immeasurable impact that poor care and adverse outcomes can have on a family, and remain committed to supporting trust to deliver safe, compassionate care and address the unacceptable disparities for women and babies. While maternity services must always seek to learn and improve, I would like to recognise the dedication and commitment of the vast majority of the maternity workforce. I know that everyone who joins the healthcare profession sets out to deliver safe and compassionate care, and I would like to acknowledge the effort and ability of so many maternity professionals who work tirelessly for the women and babies they care for. The Secretary of State has last week announced the improving care during and after pregnancy will be one of her top priorities for implementing the Women's Health Strategy in 2024. A key tenet of this is continuing to deliver NHS's England's 3-year plan for maternity and neonatal services. The plan sets out how NHS England will make maternity and neonatal care safer, more personalised and more equitable for women, babies and families. In addition to this, since 2021, we have invested an additional £165 million a year to improve maternity and neonatal care. This year, in 24-25, that will increase to £186 million a year. The government has also set a national maternity safety ambition to halve the 2010 rates of stillbirths, neonatal and maternal deaths and brain injuries that occur during or soon after the birth by 2025, alongside a further ambition to reduce the rate of preterm births from 8% to 6% by 2025. And to Baroness Taylor's question, progress to date is there's been a 23% reduction. So progress, but I freely admit, is not enough. So perhaps at this stage I would like to try and individually address a lot of the points that have been made. I think, firstly, the points made by many noble lords around, including Baroness Taylor and Baroness Warwick. I thank, when we talk about staffing, Lord Patel's offer to come and help maybe once more, and Baroness Watkins, and I'm sure she's bright enough to do it as well. But I think we do recognise the importance of staffing. There has been a 14% increase since 2010, and I mentioned that unlike other areas of the health service, of course, the birth rate is something that has remained stable during that time. So that is a real times increase, for want of a better word. But I completely accept the points made in terms of the importance of training and retention in all of this, and the points that Baroness Warwick was making in terms of really understanding what are the numbers that are required to really make sure we've got the right provision going forward. And of course, that is what the long-term workforce plan is all about. But I think within that and within the retention agenda, the points made in terms of sabbaticals by Baroness Watkins, the use of loan repayments, and smart stuff using technology in terms of flexibility and staff apps, that should all be part of the toolkit. And again, I've seen some very good examples of that in places such as Milton Keynes. I'm talking more generally about staff here, where they're using a staff app to allow exactly that sort of flexibility. And if we want to be a modern employer competing in a modern world, those sorts of things, enabling sabbaticals, enabling that sort of flexibility, I agree, is key. Specifically to Baroness Taylor as well, in terms of the local services her way. My understanding is that Bronte Birth Unit will open again in April 24, hopefully, but do accept obviously some of the issues that have been there. I would like to respond directly to Baroness Converidge as well, and saying yes, I absolutely do believe in continuity of care as being a key tenet in terms of what we're trying to do, but do accept that needs to be built into the long-term workforce plan and some of those allocations. And it is, as Baroness Watkins says, it is vital in all of that we're listening not just to the mothers, and the staff taught to listen not just to the mothers, but as you say, the partners as well in all of that. The point made in terms of access to interpreters is a very good one, and again, in the many things I'll write back on, I will please come back on that as well. And I think an excellent point about making sure that staff understand the needs of mothers with learning difficulties is a very important thing. I will come back on the detail, particularly around the passports mentioned there. I also actually absolutely agree with the point that Baroness Donaghy makes in terms of the long-term relationship with staff. You've got to avoid a situation of winners and losers. Did we win the last battle? All you're doing is creating the bad feeling for the next battle within that. I'd now like to move on specifically to the many points raised on safety, which of course is key to this whole debate. And I think the point made by Baroness Armstrong as well, that actually that time defines so much of a mother's relationship with a child, from how that whole birth did take place. It's impossible to have this debate, as many noble lords have mentioned, Baroness Armstrong, particularly Baroness Gohere, Baroness Bennett and Thornton, that you can't, this debate, obviously the ethnic minorities and the learning difficulties, those disparities are a key part of this. And I remember our conversation, Baroness Thornton, very, very well on this. Specifically, the maternal task force is meeting regularly. It did meet last September. It is meeting again next week. And that is chaired by Minister Caulfield, and is a fundamental tool in this. But I think the point made, particularly by Baroness Gohere, in terms of making sure we've got the data and the analysis to be able to do that, is vital. I will come back on the points around NHS resolution to understand that. I wouldn't be surprised, saying all of that, that actually that might not show actually that there's more disputes from people with ethnic minorities, because maybe actually they don't feel as confident enough to use NHS resolution either. So I think there's probably quite a lot to unpack from all of that, but I will come back and in writing on all of that, and clearly make sure, as I say, we're including the learning difficulties point as part of that as well. I share the concerns again brought up by Baroness Maron and Taylor and others around the CQC reports. Clearly a situation where we're seeing an increase and levels of 50% or so where there's concern about inadequacy or need for improvement. That's clearly not a good situation. I know that the NHS have an implementation plan. To Lord Patel's point, it's the action that really counts. I know they have an implementation plan for each trust to address where there is an inadequacy there, to make sure that those are being addressed. I've asked to make sure that I can see and understand all of those, and I'm asking for a report in 6 months' time, which I'm willing to share with all of us here in terms of progress against that. And to me, to the questions of should we be having an inquiry and further work on this, and the question asked by Baroness Donaghy, what would I need to inform my view to that? I think personally it is, are we really seeing progress in all of that? Because I'm very aware that, as mentioned by Noble Lords, every time you kick off a new inquiry, that can take a long time in all of that. So, if that action and that improvement plan is in place, then I will be satisfied that we are on the right track. But very openly, my view will change if I don't believe that is there. And whilst we have the benefit of Baroness Watkins as an NHS board member, it's something I might ask. I'm sure it is something that you are doing, but I think it would be an excellent topic for the NHS board to be having as well, because of course they are the front line in all of this as well. I have in terms of the case of maternal deaths, which I think we all agree is something of severe concern. I have, and the Secretary of State has commissioned urgent work to understand that. I think we do all understand it is a more complex situation. Obviously, factors such as age, obesity, diabetes are all elements that make the underlying situation more complicated. To understand, I do get into the data, just so people do have all the facts. The recent increase that we saw, it translates to about 35 extra deaths in the period. I do note, and I'm just giving the data, I'm not using this as an excuse at all, but COVID as part of the death was responsible for 38 deaths in that all. So COVID is a big component of all of this, but I won't for one moment suggest that is the only reason. And so understanding, as Lord Patel said, having a thrombosis analysis, because that is the leading cause of all this, I think is vital to all of this. We do see, though, that the introduction of the 14 maternal medicine networks, which are specialist units, which are set up to absolutely look at where there are complications and a likely need for things around thrombosis and other things, are vital parts of this. And again, I think in that report back, seeing that action will be key on this. To Baroness Donaghy's point as well, I look forward to seeing the Birth Traumatisation Institute report, and we'll obviously come back further after that. To the points made by Lord Allen and Baroness Maron, I do see data as an important role in this, and the use of the app to allow mothers to take control of their own health and their own data in all of this is vital. I had a meeting just yesterday on how we can make sure the baby red book, for want of a better word, is actually brought into the app as well, so that you start to get that day one, and the mothers start to get that through a proxy access. So in my letter, because I'm mindful of time, I will come back on the detail of that as well. So I think, as I say, being mindful of time again, I will pick up and write in detail on the other points raised. But again, I would like to thank, to me, this is the benefit of where we can have such experience and we can have these sorts of points in the debates. I, for one, have also found it useful, so I would like to thank the Baroness and everyone for the work they do in this space.
My Lords, I'd like to thank everybody who has taken part in this debate. I think we've all learnt from each other, and it has been really interesting to see the different levels of experience and how they have come together. But I hope the Minister is acknowledging that despite people coming up this from different levels of experience, the actual message is extremely clear that we do have a crisis in maternity services, and I would think that unless the government takes action quickly, we are going to see more of the scandals that have alarmed us so much in recent years. And I do think that we do all recognise the dedication, and we do all acknowledge that the staff do their best, but we are actually facing a very depressing situation and indeed a crisis. And I know that there have been calls for new inquiries and new plans, but as my noble friend Baroness Warwick said, we have got many of those, but we don't have the building blocks and the progress that is underpinning what actually needs to be done. And I'm actually struck by the fact that we do have this cycle of problems. Current midwives are overworked, so they don't have time for extra training, so they don't have enough time to mentor students, so they don't have enough time to listen to mothers, as several members have said is absolutely vital. And therefore they get burnt out, and therefore we have fewer midwives, and therefore all of these pressures intensify. And I think that really that is the crux of where we are now. Unless we can break into that cycle and find some ways of giving experienced midwives the support that they need, then this problem is going to continue. Of course, there are problems in terms of students and dropouts, and Baroness Watkins mentioned the cost of second qualifications, and I don't think we should ignore that as one of the reasons why so many experienced nurses are actually deterred from moving into midwifery. And similarly with the issues my noble friend Baroness Donnelly made about pay structures, these are points that the ministers could take on board and could move quickly on. And I hope that the minister, having listened to so many voices, will actually feel that he can have some confidence that things need to be done in certain ways. Similarly, I think that the evidence that Baroness Gohar gave us, which everybody took note of and everybody understood, and everybody was a bit surprised about, in terms of the lack of data on some of those crucial issues and some of the systematic racism, which I think she was uncovering there. Maybe the answers are, as Lord Allen suggests, different ways of working with the IT systems, but it is something that I think the Minister could make real progress on very quickly, and I hope that that debate has helped him in this respect. I hope that what he said about the Bronte Birthing Centre in Dewsbury is correct. We do want to see it opened in April, but it is dependent on the staff being available. And incidentally, when you lose a place like the Birthing Centre in Dewsbury or the facility in Huddersfield, you don't just lose the maternity, the labour provisions for women. You actually lose the student placement positions that allow you to train more people. So it really is a very serious situation. My Lords, we can all agree that women deserve good local facilities when they're in the maternity services. All women need proper care. All midwives, I would say, deserve the joy and the pleasure of seeing women cared for properly in healthy births that Lord Patel was talking about. I think that to achieve that, we do need a step change, and I hope that this debate has been one significant step forward in urging ministers to look at this problem with a new eye and new determination. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as that opinion will say content, contrary not content, the contents have it. My Lords, I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that His Majesty the King has signified his royal assent to the following acts and measures: Post Office Horizon System Compensation Act, Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act, Church of England Miscellaneous Provisions Measure, Church of England Pensions Application of Capital Funds Measure. My Lords, I'm going to allow a few moments' grace before I call the next business. My Lords, question for short debate, the closure of high street banks and the need for a national network of banking hubs. Perhaps I could just remind the House that we are very tight for time and it behoves everyone to speak within the amount allowed. Baroness Tyler of Enfield.
My Lords, I declare an interest as a member of the Financial Inclusion Commission and President of the Money Advice Trust. I'm very grateful to the Library for its excellent briefing and to the many external organisations who've provided me with briefing, and I've been struck by the strength of feeling expressed.